As the Americans slipped from Rocherath-Krinkelt into the winter dusk, 350 hidden guns waited to erase the 12th SS Panzer Division. What looked like a collapse on the edge of the Ardennes was nothing of the kind. It was a hand extended, a road opened, an invitation engraved in snow and silence. For 3 days, the twin villages had been a furnace. Panthers wedged in alleys, bazookas cracking from rooftops, artillery airbursts shredding the rubble. Then, in the space of an afternoon, the defenders stepped back in order, heads low, engines quiet, and vanished toward a bare ridge they had measured to the yard long before the first shell fell. The trap did not spring with rifles. It waited for math. To understand why this worked, one must begin with the iron cage in which the German army fought. For years, a single rule governed its commanders: hold every position, give up nothing, retreat only by the personal grace of Adolf Hitler. Heinz Guderian, the architect of Lightning War and the conqueror of France, learned it when he asked to pull back from Moscow and lost his command for daring to suggest it. By early 1945, a battalion could not move a few hundred meters without an answer from a bunker in Berlin. Ground was sacred. To abandon it under any circumstance was to confess defeat. So when German scouts watched American infantry peel away by companies, when they saw engineers wiring what could not be moved and tanks covering the last men out, they read the moment through that iron rule. The enemy was breaking. The road ahead was open. They could not see the web that had already been spun over every field, lane, and crossroads beyond the villages. They would learn within hours that leaving the village was not the end of the fight. It was the beginning of something worse. The Americans had not discovered this in Belgium. They learned it the hard way, in North Africa, in a place called Kasserine Pass. There, in February of 1943, the United States Army met German armor in force for the first time and was routed. Guns overrun, units scattered, communications severed, 6,500 casualties in 5 days. The shock reached Washington. Eisenhower relieved a corps commander who had hidden his headquarters in a ravine far from the line. But the most important change did not wear a new star. It sat behind the guns. Within 2 weeks of Kasserine, the artillery doctrine of the American Corps in Tunisia was rewritten. No longer would a single battalion support a single regiment and die with it. A forward observer could now summon every battery within range. One lieutenant with a radio and a map could bring an entire corps to bear on a single grid square. The proof came at Guettar. There in March, the same German division that rolled through Kasserine drove into a valley mined deep and watched over by quiet eyes on the heights. When panzers halted to clear lanes, American guns that had never trained together were firing on the same point within minutes. Dozens of tanks burned before noon. A second attack came. Observers held their fire until infantry closed, then lifted shells to airburst over heads and hurled high explosive into the armor behind. The valley emptied. For the first time in the war, American forces had stopped seasoned German armor head-on. This new system carried a name that frightened those who felt it: time on target. Artillery usually warns. The first impacts send men to ground, where they survive the salvos that follow. Time on target removed the warning. Fire direction centers calculated the flight time of every gun, near and far, slow and fast, so that every round arrived within seconds of the rest. No ranging shots, no creeping line. One moment the world was quiet, the next it detonated in unison. A German officer later described 40 men lost in 6 seconds on a road the Americans had left an hour before. He never heard a single gunfire. Now return to the Ardennes and to a general who looked behind him before the storm. On December 11, 1944, ordered to attack east toward the Rohr dams, General Walter Robertson studied the ground to his west and chose a contingency the Germans would never have been permitted to plan. Elsenborn Ridge, a boomerang of high earth with open approaches to the east and roads to the rear. Enough flat space for the guns of an entire corps. He told no one beyond his staff. 5 days later, the Great Offensive began. On the northern shoulder of Calamity, the 2nd Infantry Division and the Green 99th bled for 3 days in the twin villages, while engineers reinforced the single road behind them and gunners stacked ammunition behind the ridge. On December 19, Robertson gave the order: destroy what cannot move, withdraw in sequence. Hold the rear guard, then blow the road. The next morning, German commanders saw streets choked with wreckage and empty foxholes. They marked the ridge as the next objective and sent veterans of Normandy across frozen fields. 800 meters, slightly uphill, no cover. They never reached the line. 350 American guns fired together, the largest concentration yet assembled in the European theater, fell in a single storm. Proximity fuses burst the air into knives. The 12th SS Panzer Division became a memory on that slope. On December 22, the 1st Infantry Division alone fired 10,000 rounds near Butgenbach. Tanks that broke through the rifle line found no infantry left to follow. On December 26, a fresh assault dissolved the moment it began. The northern shoulder did not bend. It was the only sector in which the Germans advanced not a single meter. It held because the ground had been traded for a killing field. Why did the Germans never see it coming, even after Guettar, even after Elsenborn, even after report upon report described the same pattern? The answer lies beneath weapons and maps. It lives in who was trusted to decide. In the German army, to fall back without permission was a crime that could end a career or a life. In the American army, lieutenants were taught to think about flanks and fields of fire, to weigh ground by its utility to the guns, and to act without waiting for a distant headquarters that could not see the snow in a ditch or the angle of a slope. German interrogators noticed that American withdrawals did not look like routes. Units kept cohesion, wounded came with them. New positions were on higher ground with wire already laid. The word that kept surfacing in reports was the same: incomprehensible. There is an irony at the heart of that word. In 1917, as the Western Front bled, German thinkers invented elastic defense. Outposts would yield. Battle zones would hold. Reserves would counterattack. Space would be traded for time, and the attacker would arrive beyond the reach of his own guns. It was brilliant. It was German. And a generation later, a dictator strangled it. Orders from above turned doctrine to stone. Commanders who knew better could not act. The army that had written the book on giving ground was forced to hold every hedge in every village until there was no army left to hold them. The Americans did not retrieve a forgotten German manual. They learned from their own defeat. They built a chain that ran from a 23-year-old with a handset to a corps of howitzers, and they calibrated it to favor the man on the spot. When they pulled back, it was into pre-registered space. When they stayed, it was often to look down upon the enemy's roads and tell the guns where to aim. So consider one more hill, August 6, 1944, south of Mortain. A forward observer named Robert Weiss climbed a limestone knob called Hill 314. He could see 15 miles in every direction. He spent the afternoon registering targets on every road and crossroads within range. That night, 4 Panzer Divisions moved through the dark to strike west and cut Patton from his supply line. At dawn, they swarmed around the hill and flowed past it, like a river ignores a rock. 700 Americans were cut off, surrounded, hungry, and low on ammunition. 2 men had radios and clear eyes on the plain below. When the fog burned off, they began to call fire. Division answered. Corps answered. The roads became lines of fire. German commanders did what doctrine demanded. They tried to take the hill. Assault after assault broke under rifles and under shells called so close that the Americans felt the shock in their chests. Ammunition dwindled. Food was gone by the second day. The radio batteries were dying, and with them the link that was breaking the attack. The gunners answered with a solution almost beyond belief. They packed fresh batteries and blood plasma into empty smoke shell canisters and shot them onto the hill. Some fell to the enemy, most did not. The observers stayed on the air. By the time fighter bombers joined the hunt, the artillery had already savaged the attack. Of the 70 tanks that led the blow, 40 were gone within 2 days. A division once named for guard duty around a leader's person appeared in dispatches as remnants. A week later, the force that had lunged at Mortain was trapped in the Falaise pocket and destroyed. The pattern is unmistakable. At Elsenborn, the Americans gave ground and won. At Mortain, they stood on a height and won. At Guettar, they waited behind mines and won. In each case, the same quiet mechanism turned space into lethality. Forward observers in the right place. Targets registered before the first man moved. Fire direction that can mass a corps in 9 minutes. 3 minutes for the battalion. 6 for the division. 9 for the whole. time on target that killed before men could lie down, and a culture that allowed a captain or a lieutenant or a sergeant to choose the better ground without asking a far-off voice for permission. When the snow at Elsenborn finally settled, divisions that had once been feared were names only. The ridge had been chosen days before the storm. The withdrawal had been measured to the hour. The guns had done the rest. The men who walked down from Hill 314 weighed barely more than their rifles. Their radios had lived because artillerists fired medicine at them. The lesson they carried was simple and terrible. Ground is not a trophy. Ground is a tool. Sometimes the most powerful act is to leave it and let the enemy have what no longer matters. German officers called it confusion. American gunners called it fire planning. The riflemen who moved in the snow called it survival. Pull back, call fire, let the math do the killing. And every time the enemy followed.